Welcome to Betrayal Narrative X.
Michael had never considered himself the perfect husband, but he tried. He worked his ass off to make sure their family didn't need anything, took extra shifts when Lisa wanted a new car, and was always the first to reconcile after arguments. But lately, something had changed. She no longer looked at him the way she used to. There was no warmth, no tenderness, not even simple interest in her gaze. It was as if he was just a comfortable piece of furniture that stood in the house, but didn't evoke any emotion. At first he thought it was just fatigue, a seasonal slump, stress at work. I mean, we all go through rough patches. But then he noticed that she was becoming more and more distant. Hugs became rare, kisses turned into duty nods, and words of love disappeared as if they had never existed. When he tried to hold her against him in the evening, she would pull away and say she was tired or not in the mood. It happened more and more often, until one day he decided to ask her directly. "Lisa, what's going on with you?" He asked her that evening as they sat in the kitchen. "You hardly talk to me. You avoid touching me. Is it because of work? Or is it something else?" She slowly looked up from the phone and looked at him as if he had said something offensive. "I don't have to explain anything to you," she said coldly, shrugging her shoulders. "I don't owe you anything." Michael blinked, trying to realize what he had just heard. Nothing. Not even basic warmth. Lisa crossed her arms over her chest and sighed heavily, as if talking to him was torture. "Yes, Michael, that's exactly right. I don't have to give you intimacy if I don't want to. I don't have to be nice to you if I'm not in the mood. And I certainly don't have to act the way you like." There was a tense silence in the room. He stared at her, unable to believe that this woman he'd lived with for over 15 years had just said that to him. Lisa had always been emotional, but there was usually some regret in her words, a modicum of concern. But now there was a completely alien, cold woman sitting in front of him, who didn't seem to care about his feelings at all. He got up slowly from the table and walked silently to the bedroom. That night he lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, until at last one simple but painful thought formed in his mind. If she doesn't owe me anything, then maybe I don't owe her anything either. He didn't know yet that this thought would change everything. The next morning Michael woke up with a heaviness in his chest, but he didn't say a word. Lisa had already left for work, leaving a half-empty cup of cold coffee on the kitchen table. She hadn't even bothered to wash it, as if he was destined to clean up after her like he always did. But something in him broke at that moment. In the past, he would have automatically rinsed the cup, made her dinner for her return, bought her favorite orchids on his way home from work, hoping to evoke some warm emotion in her gaze. But today he just turned around and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the dirty dishes where they were. It was a normal day at work, but her words kept running through my mind. "I don't owe you anything." They hurt his ego, making him reconsider everything he'd done for her over the past few years. How many times had he put aside his desires to please her? How many times had he yielded when she sulked over trifles? How many times had he forgiven her indifference because he believed it was just temporary? At lunch, he sat at the table with Thomas, his best friend, who had long tried to open his eyes to the situation. "You look like you've just been given a terminal diagnosis." Thomas snorted, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Almost there." Michael grinned bitterly, leaning back in his chair. Lisa had said yesterday that she didn't owe me anything. No warmth, no intimacy, no explanations. Thomas frowned, setting the food aside. "Is she serious?" "Absolutely." "Dude." Thomas scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You're always humping her, and she acts like you have to put up with her antics. Maybe it's time to show her what life looks like when you don't owe anyone anything to." Michael looked at his friend and felt something in his chest turn over. Yes, he'd always been the one invested in marriage, but what was he getting in return? Suddenly he realized that he didn't have to try to please her. She didn't even think it was necessary to show him basic respect. After work, he didn't go home as he usually did, but stopped by the gym, which he had been meaning to visit for a long time, but had always put off because of chores around the house. He stayed there for almost 2 hours, relieving the tension he had accumulated on the treadmill and in the weight room. When he came out of there, his muscles were humming nicely, and the thoughts in his head were surprisingly clear. When he got home, he didn't heat up dinner for Lisa, didn't ask her how her day was. He just showered and sat down to watch TV, completely ignoring her presence. Lisa came into the house late, mumbled something indifferently, and went into the bedroom without even looking at him. Before, he would have gone after her, tried to talk to her, find out why she was acting like this. But now he just shrugged and changed the channel. A few days passed, and his behavior began to bear the first fruits. Lisa noticed that he no longer took care of her the way he used to. She no longer found her clothes neatly washed and folded in the closet. Her favorite coffee he made in the morning was gone. The dinner that always waited for her after work was suddenly no longer on the table. It annoyed her, but she didn't bring it up. It was as if she were trying to ignore the obvious, hoping that sooner or later he would give up and return to his usual image of a caring husband. A week passed, and Michael began to notice the first signs of Lisa's irritation. She still pretended that nothing was going on, but her behavior gave away her displeasure. She began to close the cabinets more noisily, sighing defiantly when she entered the kitchen and did not find the usual dinner. Usually he always bought her favorite foods, made sure there was fresh fruit in the fridge, cooked her favorite meals on the weekends. Now he took only what he liked and cooked only for himself. Lisa, who was used to his care, began to get annoyed. "Why isn't my yogurt in the fridge?" she asked one evening when she looked into the kitchen. Michael quietly looked up from the plate of pasta he had prepared for himself. "You work. You're a grown woman. You can buy it yourself." She blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Before, he would have jumped up to go to the store and buy her whatever she wanted. Now he didn't feel the least bit guilty about his indifferent reaction. "You always bought it when you went grocery shopping," Lisa said irritably, slamming the refrigerator door shut. "And you've always been warm to me. But something's changed," Michael said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "I was just adjusting to the new reality." Lisa pressed her lips together, but didn't continue the conversation. She turned and left for the bedroom, closing the door loudly behind her. Michael only grinned. He could see now that she didn't like the fact that he was no longer putting her desires above his. The next day, he stopped by the gym again after work. He began to notice that his workouts were doing him good. His muscles were stronger and his posture more confident. The look in the mirror no longer reflected tired, exhausted husband trying to please a woman who didn't appreciate his efforts. Now he saw a man who respected himself and his desires. On his way out of the gym, he ran into Caitlin, a co-worker he'd worked with for several years. She had always been friendly, but now she was looking at him with obvious interest. "Michael, did you join the gym?" she asked with a smile, looking him over from head to toe. "Yeah, decided to change my habits a bit," he replied, shrugging his shoulders. "It's definitely good for you." Her gaze lingered on his face a little longer than usual. "You look, how shall I put it, more confident." He grinned, surprised at her candor. "Thank you, Caitlin. That's nice to hear. Well, if you ever want company on a run or a workout together, I don't mind," she added with a wink. Michael nodded, but didn't answer too enthusiastically. He didn't know what he wanted out of his life yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to be the kind of man who begged for love anymore. When he got home, he noticed Lisa sitting in the living room, nervously flipping through the tape on her phone. She hadn't even looked up when he walked in, but he caught a quick, wary glance in his direction. She suspected something, and he liked that. Lisa tried to maintain an indifferent look, but Michael could sense that she was tense. When he entered the room, she furtively cast quick glances at him, as if trying to figure something out. Her cell phone, which used to be always in her hand, was now often face down. She left earlier in the mornings and stayed longer than usual in the evenings. But the interesting thing was different. Her irritation was growing by the day. Michael stopped asking where she'd been, stopped showing interest in her moods, stopped adjusting his life to suit her. And that, by all accounts, was confusing her. One evening, when he got out of the shower, Lisa was sitting on the bed typing something into her phone. When she heard his footsteps, she quickly turned off the screen and put the device on the nightstand. "You're back late today," she said without looking up. Michael picked up a towel and began wiping his hair, taking his time to answer. Yeah, I got held up. Where have you been? He grinned when he heard that question. She didn't ask how his day had gone, didn't ask if he was tired. She was only interested in one thing, where he'd been. At the gym. Then I stopped for dinner, he replied calmly, looking at her. Lisa nodded, but he noticed her fingers nervously clutching the corner of the pillow. Alone? Does it matter? Michael tilted his head, watching her reaction. Lisa looked up at him, a shadow of irritation flickering in her eyes. I was just asking, and I was just answering. He shrugged and turned away, making it clear he wasn't going to continue this conversation. He heard her sigh noisily, but said nothing more. After a few days, he noticed that she was acting even stranger. She used to be able to sit on her phone for hours, but now she would leave the room when she got a call. When she texted, her fingers moved quickly, and then she would immediately lock the screen. One evening he walked into the bedroom and saw her standing by the mirror, picking out jewelry. Lisa rarely dressed up in recent years, but now she was wearing a beautiful dress, makeup, and a light perfume. Going somewhere? He asked, leaning against the door jamb. She flinched slightly, but immediately turned back to him with a careless smile. Yeah, I go out with my girlfriends. With what? What's the difference? Just wondering. Michael crossed his arms over his chest. Well, if you must know, it's Cindy and Rachel, she said, rolling her eyes. He nodded, but for some reason he didn't believe her. She'd always talked easily about meeting her friends before, but today her voice sounded unnatural. Lisa quickly grabbed her purse and headed for the exit. When the front door slammed, Michael remained standing in the room, looking out the window. A few minutes later, he saw her walk outside and head not to her car, but to a black sedan that was waiting on the sidewalk. A man stepped out of it. He smiled at her, and then lightly put his hand on her lower back, helping her into the car. Michael didn't follow the car in which Lisa had left. He didn't try to find excuses for her behavior, didn't delude himself with hopes that everything was not as it seemed. He knew his wife too well not to realize what was going on. He sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the street. He had no pain, no rage, no desire to figure things out. How many years had he fought for this marriage, clinging to the memories of who they used to be? How many times had he turned a blind eye to her indifference, hoping it was just a temporary crisis? He remembered her cold words. I don't owe you anything. Something had snapped in him the night she'd said it, and now that fracture was final. She really didn't owe him anything, but he owed her nothing now either. He stood up, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and took a slow sip. The conversation with Thomas, who had been trying to open his eyes for a long time, suddenly came to mind. When a woman starts treating you like you should be treated, he once said, that means she is no longer afraid of losing you. And when she's not afraid of losing you, you've already lost. Michael hadn't wanted to hear those words then, but now they echoed in his mind. He'd lost the moment, he'd let her take him for granted. But now the rules of the game have changed. The next day he decided not to pretend as if nothing had happened. He didn't make a scene, didn't ask questions, didn't try to figure things out. Instead, he took action. He didn't buy a gym membership just to distract himself. Now he had specific goals. To get his body in shape, to feel the strength he'd suppressed for so long by focusing on satisfying other people's needs. He changed his clothing style, tossing out old clothes he'd worn for years and buying a few classic shirts that emphasized his figure. At work, he noticed that his colleagues treated him differently. Men nodded respectfully when he passed by. Women looked at him differently from before. Caitlin, with whom he sometimes chatted at lunch, was now openly flirting with him, and he did nothing to stop her. Lisa began to notice the change. She didn't say anything at first, but he could see her eyes lingering on him longer than usual. She could no longer ignore the fact that he had changed. And then the questions began. Do you go to the gym every night now? She asked him one day at dinner, which she was cooking for herself because he had stopped doing it for her. Yes, he replied, taking a bite of the piece of steak he had prepared for himself. How long is this going to last? I think so. The next day she stayed late again after work. He didn't ask where she'd been, but when she returned, he noticed her stare. "What did you do tonight?" she asked, setting the bag on the table. "Had dinner at a restaurant," he replied calmly, not lifting his eyes from the phone screen. "Alone?" "No, I don't." She froze, and silence hung in the room. "With who?" He smiled, but gave her no answer. Now she was in the same situation she had once left him in. Lisa could no longer ignore what was happening, no matter how hard she tried. Michael had changed, and she could feel it with every cell in her body. He was no longer the man who had once tried to please her, tried to earn her attention, tried to make their marriage comfortable for her. Now he was living his life as he pleased. She couldn't say exactly when she'd first felt anxious. Maybe the moment he'd stopped asking where she'd been. Maybe when she'd seen him leave the house in his perfectly fitting shirt with his new perfume. Or maybe when she realized he no longer waited for her in the evenings. He used to always be there for her. He asked her how her day was, made her tea when he saw she was tired. He sat next to her on the couch, even if she was interested in a movie and he wasn't. He cared about everything, even if he didn't get anything in return. Now he was completely calm and indifferent, and that frightened her more than anything. She saw how different he looked. Her husband was no longer the tired, depressed man who was used to enduring his wife's coldness. He was more confident, more attractive, and most importantly, freer. But what disturbed her most were his answers. They became short, precise, and too easy, without a hint of eagerness to please. "You're back late," she said one evening when he walked in the house, wearing a fresh shirt and a slight whiff of feminine perfume that wasn't hers. "Yes, delayed," he replied calmly, taking off his jacket. "Where have you been?" "Dinner." "With who?" "Why do you need to know that?" Her heart clenched, but she pretended not to pay attention to his words. He would never have answered like that before. He'd always told her everything. Now he no longer felt he owed her an explanation. She remembered telling him herself a couple weeks ago, I don't owe you anything." At the time, she'd been sure she'd been in control. Now she realized that she might have lost him the moment she'd said those words. That same night, she decided to check his cell phone. He'd never set a password before, but now the lock screen was greeted with a code she didn't know. Lisa clutched the phone in her hand, feeling an unpleasant chill run down her spine. She looked up and saw him standing in the bedroom doorway with his arms crossed over his chest. "Are you looking for something?" She flinched, but immediately straightened up, trying to look calm. "Just wanted to see what time it was," she lied, putting the phone back down. "Lisa, you don't need my phone number to get the time." She didn't know what to answer, so she just left the room, feeling an unpleasant feeling growing in her chest that she hadn't encountered before. Jealousy. She had never felt it for him. She'd always been sure he'd be there for her, that he loved her, that he wasn't going anywhere. Now he was a man who could leave, and the thought scared her to tears. Lisa tried to convince herself that she was still in control, but the anxiety inside her grew stronger every day. She could no longer pretend that the changes in Michael didn't bother her. He was withdrawing in the evenings, spending less time at home, barely talking to her or sharing his thoughts. But the most frustrating part was that he no longer showed the slightest bit of jealousy or interest in her life. Before, he'd always noticed when she put on a new dress or changed her hair. Now he looked past her, as if she were just a part of the interior that no longer attracted his attention. He didn't ask where she was going, didn't wait for her to return, and didn't look suspicious if she was late. And it pissed her off. Lisa didn't know why, but made her angry that he had accepted her coldness so calmly. She had expected him to be angry, jealous, confronted, demanding an explanation. Instead, he'd just let the situation go, and now she felt unnecessary. But the worst of it was another thing. She no longer knew where he was in the evenings. He'd go to the gym, then stay late, and when he came back, he smelled not only of sweat and shower gel, but something else foreign. A faint feminine perfume clung to his clothes, and there was a slight smile on his face that she hadn't seen in a long time. Lisa tried to ignore the signs, but they were becoming more and more obvious. One evening, she decided to check where he was. When he left, she opened her laptop and logged into his account on the family cell phone carrier. She'd never done this before, but today her hands were shaking with nervous tension. She looked at the latest geolocations. A gym, then a restaurant, and then an address she didn't recognize. It wasn't their home, it wasn't someone's office, and it wasn't a place he'd been before. Lisa looked at the address one more time before realizing that she couldn't sit in obscurity any longer. She grabbed her keys, threw on her coat, and walked out of the house, trying to remain calm. When she pulled up to the designated spot, her heart was beating so loud, she thought she could hear it echoing in her ears. It was a small apartment complex in the city center. New houses, clean yards, well-maintained entrances. She stared at the building in front of her and didn't know what to do. If she went upstairs now, what would she say? How would she explain her appearance? But her doubts were dispelled when she saw the front door of the house open, and Michael stepped out. A woman walking beside him, tall, slender, with long blonde hair, laughing as she looked at him. But that wasn't the worst part. Michael looked at her the way he had once looked at Lisa. Warm, interested, full of life. She didn't know how long she stood looking at them. She couldn't move from her seat, couldn't take her eyes off the scene. Michael walked the woman to her car, said something, and they said goodbye with light kisses and touched each other's shoulders. Then he turned and saw Lisa, and their eyes met. There was a slight surprise in his eyes, and something else, probably indifference, and that broke Lisa the hardest. Lisa stood still, feeling everything inside collapsing. Her heart was pounding frantically in her chest, her palms were sweating, and her thoughts were racing erratically, making it hard to focus. She couldn't believe this was really happening. Michael, her husband, was standing in front of her with another woman, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. They stared at each other, and the silence between them was deafening. Michael didn't make a single move, didn't try to justify himself, didn't try to soften the situation. He just stared, calmly, confidently, with no sign of guilt or embarrassment. Lisa swallowed, feeling rage mixed with panic rising in her chest. "Who's that?" Her voice sounded hoarse, almost a whisper, but she couldn't speak louder. Michael looked at the woman, who was already getting into her car, then shifted his gaze back to Lisa. "It doesn't matter," he replied calmly, shoving his hands in his pockets. She blinked, not believing her ears. "Doesn't matter?" Her voice grew louder, and she stepped forward. "Are you serious?" "Lisa, what do you want from me?" Michael raised his eyebrows, looking at her almost curiously. "You were the first to say you didn't owe me anything. Now I'm living the life I want to live." Those words pierced her like a sharp knife. She said it herself, and pushed him away. She rejected his love, his care, his desires. But she didn't think he'd ever really stop fighting for her. "Are you getting revenge on me?" she asked, clenching her hands into fists, trying to maintain control. "No, Lisa. I just stopped clinging to a man who didn't need me." He sighed, shaking his head. "That's what you wanted, wasn't it?" She opened her mouth, but didn't know what to say. She wanted to scream that no, she didn't want to, that she was wrong, that she didn't think he could let her go so easily. But she realized that would be a lie. She really believed that he would always be there for her, that he would never leave, that he would always forgive her coldness and indifference. She was wrong. Michael looked at her one last time, then turned around and walked to his car. "Where are you going?" Her voice shook as she took a step forward. "Home," he answered calmly, without turning around. "I'm going home, too," she mumbled, trying to think of what to say. He opened the car door and froze for a moment, then turned his head. "Do what you want, Lisa." His voice was flat and impassive. "I don't ask you where you are or who you're with anymore. Now you don't ask me either." Michael got into the car, started the engine, and drove off without looking at her. She was left standing in the street, unable to believe that it was really over and she had lost him. And the worst part was that it was her fault. Why is it that some people are like that? Why do they only begin to appreciate when they lose? Why is it that a woman can look at her husband for months and not notice him, but when he smiles at someone else, she suddenly starts to care? Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you liked the story, please give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Your support helps the algorithm show my content more often. If you are new to the channel, Do not forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep making more stories for you.